And next up, we have now, uh, so from Bulgaria, we are now moving to Germany, Austria, and Czech Republic with a lecture by Julia SECKLEHNER titled New Realisms in Central Europe, Painting, Photography, and Design. Julia SECKLEHNER specializes in the history of modern art and visual culture in Central Europe. She is a 2024-2025 Alexander von Humboldt Foundation Fellow at Constructor University in Bremen and otherwise based at Masaryk University in Brno in Czech Republic. Her book, Rethinking Modern Austrian Art Beyond the Metropolis, received the Masaryk University Science Award in 2024. So, Julia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the nice introduction and thank you for the wonderful organization. I thought about doing this sort of big overview, but in the end, I think I'm dealing with quite a specific problem, which I hope will intersect with many of the papers that we've already heard. Oh, I have to change the presentation. Sorry, no problem. No problem. So this is where we are. So my presentation today outlines some variations and interpretations of new realism in Central Europe, focusing on photography and painting. More specifically, I consider how they provided a strong counterpoint to the idealization of the countryside that circulated widely in the region. By moving away from new realisms as an integral part of the metropolitan modernity that often takes focus in the golden 20s, I argue for the potential of a new perspective that transcends the urban context of new realism and assesses how it functions as a critical style in the face of the idealization commonly associated with the countryside. Specifically, I reconsider the complexities underlying the notion of so-called Slovak modernism as a variant of modern culture in Czechoslovakia, largely identified by a focus on village life, folklore traditions, and rural areas. So using different representations of the countryside as a starting point, I contend that the countryside became a highly contested ideological space where artists created competing realisms, the significance of which has long been overshadowed by an emphasis on the city as a site of modernity. As Peter Demetz noted, for example, and this is a quote, modernity means above all a modernization that thrives in the industrial world of the new metropolis, an emancipatory nationalism, and a democratization based on widening suffrage to include women and working people. End of quote. And building upon this, I examine how the rural was constructed within precisely these processes of modernization. In a social and political environment intensely concerned with affirming a national identity after Hungarian governance and Magyarization policy, the mythification of Slovakia as a singing, warm-hearted, hospitable, meek, and non-aggressive nation, this again was a quote, often clashed with the social realism of impoverished areas. These contradictions between romanticization and social hardships formed one of the central paradoxes of Slovak interwar art, straddling the line between activist and socially engaged work by leftist artists such as Imre Vajna Král and the nationalistically imbued works of painters like Martin Benka. In this light, and within the framework of a symposium hosted in a transnational city, if that is the right word, the Slovak example is particularly pertinent as a case study for the broader tendencies of Central Europe's nationalized histories. I must emphasize from the outset that its positioning as a form of modernism with rural and homogeneous folkloric roots comes at the expense of the nuances intrinsic to Slovakia's demography at the time. Specifically, then it was one of the most multi-ethnic and multinational regions of Czechoslovakia. According to the 1921 consensus, over 1 in 3 million people in Slovakia did not identify as Czech or Slovak. In addition to the significant German and Hungarian minorities, the country was also home to several thousand individuals identifying as Rusin or Jewish, not to mention the country's most ostracized minority, the Roma, And just to add to this as well, of course, in a consensus, you would choose the nationality that would suit you most. So actually the numbers would be much higher, we can assume. But as Christine Blümel and Michael McCluskey have emphasized, the concept of the ideal countryside is often shaped by middle class and urban perceptions of specific areas as a site of nostalgic retreat divorced from modernity and modernization. The value systems dominating the countryside are characterized by terms such as rural, country, pastoral, nationalism, and nostalgia. Predominantly guided by the notion of a national revival, at the turn of the 20th century, the countryside in Central Europe has long been shaped by its identification as precisely a middle class conception of the rural idyll. Consequently, it has mainly been examined in scholarship related to turn of the century craft practices, where the appropriation and adaptation of rural and folk culture inspired the emergence of new visual forms and styles. Notably, it also portrayed the rural in the urban imagination as the national heartland amid the competing nations of the Habsburg Empire. Following the First World War, narratives around Central European modernism transformed, and the significance of the countryside diminished in favor of metropolitan avant-gardes. Nonetheless, the role of the countryside must be re-evaluated within the altered geopolitical context of the First Czechoslovak Republic in the case today. As a composite nation, including Bohemia, Moravia, Silesia, Slovakia, and Subcarpathian Ruthenia, centrally governed from Prague. A considerable portion of the state was designated as rural, and this classification continued to significantly influence the construction of new modern realities after 1918. So rather than being perceived outside modernity, the countryside was actually a vital component in reshaping local culture in response to new social and political realities, particularly in Slovakia. Efforts to deconstruct the rural idyll were particularly prominent in regions where the prevailing narrative centered on the countryside as a vital aspect of national culture. Artists like Edmund Querc, Cyprian Majernik, Koloman Sokol, and Konstantin Bauer consistently challenged this idealization, drawing extensively from elements of new realist painting. The most striking example is perhaps Majernik. Although he resided in Prague for most of the interwar years, interrupted by a period of study in Paris in 1931 and 1932, many of his works focus on Slovak rural life and folk traditions, which he approached in a highly critical and satirical manner. Building upon stark contrasts between the grotesque and rural genre scenes, Majernik highlighted that the spiritual essence of traditional Slovak life was completely empty, lacking any inner meaning. The artist's most impressive painting in this vein, never exhibited during his lifetime because of its brutal content, was Lovers at the Periphery, showing the scene of a femicide in which the balding murderer washes his hands in a washbowl while a naked female body lies on the bed behind him, blood pouring out of her many wounds and her head almost decapitated from a slashed throat. The painting resembles the Lustmord works of German contemporaries such as Otto Dix and George Grosz. Relocating the Lustmord theme from a metropolitan context to a petit bourgeois rural setting, marked by the basic washing facilities, the Madonna and Child above the bed, and the vernacular-style wardrobe in the corner, the painting transforms the rural idyll into a murder scene. In its setting and style, the work also notably resembles A Few Small Nips by the Mexican artist Frida Kahlo, which was painted in the same year. Allegedly, Kahlo created the image after encountering a newspaper article in which a man confessed to the murder, stating that he had inflicted just a few small nips on his wife. Whilst we remain unaware of the circumstances surrounding Majernik's painting, his juxtaposition of a quaint setting with appalling violence is likewise rooted in a subversion of popular painting traditions, alluding to the sensationalism of the contemporary press. The shock effect achieved through this combination disrupts visions of charming rural life and ideal family scenes, which often stand in the center of works by his better-known contemporaries. Similar, yet significantly less violent works by the artist include Two Madonnas and the somewhat more humorous A Calf, both of which demonstrate how the weighted figures and soft shapes of national painters are subverted by abstracted forms that resemble caricatures rather than humans. Featuring loosely sketched scenes of rural life, Mayanik imparts a sense of spontaneity through swift brushwork in his images, creating a light-hearted sense of ridicule in the way the woman in a calf raises her arms in an animated reaction to the calf in the vegetable garden. Compared to Lovers at the Periphery, this piece is of course considerably more light-hearted, yet it retains a similar aim of diverting attention from stoic, idealized rural scenes. Mayanik's paintings have been interpreted by his contemporaries as an assault on Slovak culture. The Czech painter and art historian Karel Šourek asked, for example, who has ever dared to view folklore in such a way? Later scholars characterized Mayanik's work as a revelation of the hollowness of folk traditions and the backwardness, so-called backwardness, of village communities. Viewed in this light, Mayanik's deconstruction of the village idyll suggests the unwavering stance of a modernist who criticizes rural culture as ensnared in folk traditions and superstitions, which he brings to light through the means of a harsh, grotesque realism. Košice-based artist Bauer adopted an alternative approach to rural realism. Refugees, for instance, emphasizes the bleakness of a moment of displacement. In the bottom right corner, a figure crouches on the ground, begging for alms or praying for relief. A little girl observes him, her bright blue dress and red beret standing out against the otherwise muted colors of the scene. Her eyes cautiously glance sideways as she clutches her bare arms, clearly cold and dressed much lighter than her companions. Each figure in the convoy, both children and adults, possess a peculiar plasticity. Softly shaded and rounded, heavy with lumpy feet, they seem to be formed from the same mass as the devastated land they traverse, drawing a connection between the desolation of the environment and the refugees' uncertain future. Refugees exemplifies the socially critical painting style that Bauer developed in the early to mid 1920s, highlighting a significant aspect of Košice painting in interwar Czechoslovakia. Largely self-trained, Bauer briefly attended the painting school in Košice run by Elemir Halas Hradil before becoming involved with the network surrounding the newly established local East Slovak Museum, where he also exhibited several times between 1921 and 1927. Although Bauer's primary profession was as a technical manager at the local power plant, he actively engaged with the cultural opportunities the museum provided. He drew inspiration from the socially conscious graphic work promoted by Eugen Krohn, following the examples of German artists such as Käthe Kollwitz and George Gross, for example. Refugees is one of several works of the same style that Bauer completed in 1927. Carrying titles such as Old Age, Condemned, and Wanderers, Bauer's work focused on themes of unease and restlessness, with scenes set in Košice and its surroundings. His main subjects were those left behind in the modernization promoted by the government, including rural laborers, vagabonds, and farmers. Throughout this process, Bauer developed a somber style that retained the heavy-weighted figures of a rural peasantry seen in the work of contemporaries like Benka, yet depicted them in far less idealized settings. Bauer's figures reveal the hardships of a life in poverty. Instead of portraying Košice as a bustling modern city, a poster child for the Czechoslovak government's efforts to integrate the eastern regions of the new state, Bauer draws attention to those whom the modernization process did not reach. While adopting models of socially engaged painting from artists focused on the urban environment, such as Gross, Bauer developed a rural realism, replacing factory chimneys with desolate backyards and industrial laborers with shepherds and vagabonds. At the same time, paintings like Refugees emphasize that Bauer transcended the regional context by highlighting scenes of universal significance aimed at depicting the lives of the poor. Mayanik and Bauer's paintings exemplify that Slovak modern painting, or modern painting in Slovakia, indeed possessed another dimension beyond the idyllic scenes of rural life that dominated in the constructions of Slovak national art. Mayanik's work critiques aspects of folk culture and its associated religiosity, depicting traditional life as a grotesque form that proves challenging to integrate into modern culture. By exposing the rural idyll as a hollow grotesque, it mocks idealized visions of country life. In contrast, Bauer critiques the rural idyll from within. Rather than attacking the perceived backwardness of rural life, as Mayonik does, Bauer reveals the harsh realities of countryside living, clearly positioning it as a political issue. This point of criticism became the predominant approach to a realist construction of the countryside, not only in Slovakia but throughout Central Europe. Most effectively, this was addressed in new media, regarded as the most realistic and capable of revealing truth, film and photography. And we've already had a very nice view on that, which I hope I can build on a little bit now. So, as avant-garde theoretician Karel Teiger asserted in the journal Dvorba, photography and film quickly ascended to become the most prominent media for depicting reality evolving in different directions. Reviewing the German Werkbund exhibition Film und Foto FIFO that we've already heard about today, when it was staged in Vienna in 1929, a commercial photographer going by the initials of SF noted, "The value of photography cannot lie with the photographic aesthetic, but with the human social intensity of what has been captured, the single criterion of everything produced. What matters is not to make photography into an art form again, but to emphasize the deep social responsibility of the photographer who does work with his given instruments that could not be achieved otherwise. This work must be an undistorted document of contemporary reality." The primary task of photography for SF was to embrace social realism, focusing on the human figure and documentary practices rather than on modernist formal experimentation. He expressed disdain for the photomontages on display and lamented the limited examples of landscape and rural photography that could only offer visitors fresh perspective on contemporary reality beyond the metropolis. SF's viewpoint not only reflects the skepticism with which conservative circles regarded modernist photography in interwar Central Europe. His references to landscape and rural photography also highlight that images of the countryside were deeply intertwined with the concept of the medium as an objective and practical tool of realism. Images of an idealized and nationalized countryside became a widely circulated aspect of popular culture, consistently affirming the role of the rural as a realm of different temporality, emphasized through photography's claims to realism. The complexity of this interplay between rural idealization and an emphasis on realism is particularly evident in the work and reception of Czech photographer Karel Blitzka, whose photographs, films, and photo books visualized the Slovak countryside from the mid-1920s onwards. By applying the sharp realism of new objectivity photography to create lyrical scenes, Blitzka's oeuvre constituted a facet of rural realism where the two temporalities of city and countryside continually merged. Blitzka's manifold interests as a pedagogue, ethnographer, musicologist, photographer, and filmmaker formed the practice with documentarian aims at its core. During the 1920s, he not only collected thousands of folk songs, melodies, and children's games, but also began capturing folk life through his camera, which he viewed as a complementary practice. His photographs and films recorded the environments where the music originated. On postcards, Blitzka's compositions of serene landscapes, shepherds, and children in folk costumes contributed to the creation of a popular image of Slovakia as an ancient cradle of folk culture. To this day, Blitzka's oeuvre is synonymous with the invention of a beautifully rural Slovakia in modern photography. Based on his idealized images of Slovak folk culture, the reception of Blitzka's work has inspired a wide array of interpretations. While some scholars have noted the exoticist flavor of his images in reference to peasant communities, others have discussed his idealization of rural scenes as an example of so-called Heimatfotografie. Such depictions affirmed folk culture as a marker of authentic national traditions anchored in the countryside, which had manifested in the 19th century. Regardless of changing fashions and the impacts of industrialization, folk culture continued to be presented as an archaic remnant that formed cultural stability through its links to national communities. Represented by almost exclusively male photographers such as Rudolf Koppitz in Austria and Blitzka in Czechoslovakia, homeland photography approached the construction of rural scenes with scientific precision. Drawing on theories from avant-garde artists such as Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, who argued that the new technologies allowed for new perspectives on reality, they constructed realistic fantasies of rural life that portrayed the countryside in its most flattering light. While their initial purpose may have been ethnographic, the popularity of Blitzka's work constructed the very rural life of bliss they purported to document, vacillating between ethnographic pictorialism and the precision of new objectivity. Blitzka's photographs, composed as genre images that eschewed references to contemporary life, were primarily created, as you might expect, for urban and international audiences. They drew upon the former repertoire of modernist photography while placing scenes in an undefined time through the selection of folkloric motifs, revealing tensions between urban, that is technological and contemporary, and rural, meaning natural and ancient, temporalities on the image surface. This approach complicates the notions of realist and non-realist photography. So in his essay, The New Realism, British photographer Derek Gardiner has remarked, "A realist photograph treats its subject as a fact. It is crisp and objective and requires the subject to speak of itself and for itself. A romantic photograph uses the subject as a vehicle, I don't know, for conveying an emotional idea and has a greater emotional potential that normally belongs to the subject itself. At its worst, romantic photography leads to that odd pastime, fancy dress photography." Blitzka's work combines the idealist and romantic objectives identified by Gardiner. The photographer's role as an ethnologist lends his work a layer of scientific credibility. At the same time, his compositions draw on a romantic lyricism that, in the spirit of national photography, idealizes the defining features of local culture. As a counterpoint to this, documentary and activist photographs set the countryside in a framework that revealed the failures of capitalism, depicting it as impoverished, isolated, and overlooked by the modern world. By merging an interest in modernist artistic production, sociology, and political activism with the camera's function as an instrument of truthfulness, social photography redefined the relationship between art and activism, form and content, and explored new ways of representing the everyday lives of those at the lower end of the class spectrum. In this regard, realism possessed a strong political dimension and was intended to serve as a tool in class struggles. Particularly relevant to the region was what Jorge Ribalta referred to as the denunciative mode of photography. So rather than celebrating idealized working class lives, it highlighted the desperate living conditions endured by impoverished citizens. However, realism, regarded as the primary aim of social photography, was not seen as intrinsic to the medium of photography. So one of the most significant challenges was the issue of form. As Matthew Witkowski has stressed, photographs were understood, however naively, to convey truths, but those truths needed to be emphasized, to be brought into play. In the process, photographers adopted experimental perspectives and compositional techniques aimed at presenting reality in its true light. Leftist theorists across Central Europe debated the correct approach to implement an aesthetic that would bolster the photograph's claim to realism. In the catalogue for the exhibition of social photography held in Prague's Metro Palace in 1934, its principal organizer Lubomir Linhart argued that one must reject bourgeois, that is artistic photography, but not outright, rather in a critical dialectical manner. Therefore, rather than dismissing experimental photographs, as we've heard before by SF, Linhart proposed they should be seen as a developmental stage that would ultimately merge with socially critical photography to create, as Fedora Parkman has noted, a photography of tomorrow combining social utility and modern style. For Slovakia, A significant, or maybe the most significant figure in this regard is Irena Blühova. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, Blühova captured images that focused on both social disadvantage and rural tradition. Her images from the 1920s present a striking blend of reportage and ethnographic perspectives that are both emotive and sensitive in their treatment of the subjects. The youngest cowherd from her photocycle Children and Child Labor, for instance, depicts two young children looking after a small herd of bathing cows. The picture plane is horizontally divided between land and water, with the two children and the cows forming the focus of a triangular composition. Taken from a slightly elevated position, the little girl in the foreground is out of focus, adding a sense of movement. The photograph has been cropped, indicating that it was produced with careful attention to compositional conventions as advised in contemporary photography magazines. Although the photograph does not contain modern elements, the way the pastoral scene is captured, with the blurred foreground and the diagonal positioning of the children, it creates an impression of snapshot spontaneity, suggesting it to be a modern photograph. Similarly, Children Without Shoes is a composition featuring a group of boys lined up against the wall. In the background, a traditional village church reinforces the rural character of the setting. In both images, the children appear content and curious, looking directly at the camera. Blühova thus offers us a subjective, realistic viewpoint where form and composition emphasize content. This approach highlights the human emotive focus of her work, subtly pointing towards the poverty she documents without idealizing or heroicizing her subjects. In contrast to the sharp and strictly composed framings that position Blitzka's camera work between realism and idealization, Blühova's photographs appear more naturalistic. Featuring some compositional flaws, such as scratches, blurs, or unusual levels of exposure, their more spontaneous quality introduces a sense of immediacy, thus placing the work closer within the realm of modernity as opposed to Blitzka's constructions of the archaic countryside. Beyond the Slovak countryside, Blühova employed similar techniques at the Dessau Bauhaus, where she studied from 1931 to 1932. Servicewoman presents a young face already marked by social hardship, offering an alternative vision to the modern young women gracing magazine covers and photo spreads of the time. By merging a working class figure with a heroic image composition, the image evokes a new kind of portraiture that gained prominence throughout the 1920s. For instance, in Helma Lersky's Everyday Heads, he captured numerous closely cropped portraits that challenge prevailing archetypes of proletarian figures, including service personnel, industrial laborers, and beggars. As Alice Steinbach remarks in her close analysis of his work, epic figures replace familiar but anonymous social types, which under normal circumstances and normal diffuse lighting would collectively be described and disparaged as the masses. In Everyday Heads, we see cleaning ladies transformed into paradigmatic figures like the Madonna. Although Lersky's work was occasionally lauded for challenging class stereotypes in leftist publications such as Der Arbeiterfotograf, his primary focus was on the transformative powers of different angles and lighting through which the human face could be remodeled in ever-changing ways. For him, the medium's possibilities were paramount. In Blühova's Servicewoman, by contrast, the social aspect of the portrait remains in focus. The aesthetic of modernist photography, close cropping, oblique angles, and harsh lighting, illuminate the individual's fate as a proletarian laborer. Shot at the Bauhaus, where photographic experiments were enthusiastically pursued, Servicewoman exemplifies student work while revealing the photographer's unwavering social commitments. The portrait highlights a new dimension of the legendary modernist art school. Blühova's images portrayed those who worked at the schools as laborers rather than solely depicting students or teachers, thus making them visible among the men and women of the Bauhaus who shaped the institution. As the compositional forms of Blühova's images adhere to their function as photographic reportages, her work exemplifies the ideal of realist photography with a political purpose, dynamic and appearing honest, since Blühova neither denies her subjective viewpoint nor her presence as a photographer. Even folkloric motifs, such as gingerbread, are distinct from the image compositions of Blitzka, as the close-up and diagonal angle present the traditional sweets in a modernist light. Soft yet avoiding the picturesque and firmly rooted in local culture without idealization, Blühova developed a photographic style that occupies a space between social photography and modernist experimentation, never prioritizing form over subject. And this is sort of to conclude. The rural, embodying tradition and archaic lifestyles, has long served as the antithesis of the city, which represents the intrinsic locus of modernity. A key element of this dichotomy lies in the distinct temporalities they relate to. The urban is characterized as fast-paced and technologically driven, while the rural appears slow and antiquated. Caught in the tensions between assertions of truthful realism and modern technology, alongside the connotations of folk culture and rural spaces as veiled in a bygone era, the modern art of rural Slovakia developed various registers through which the countryside emerged as both an imagined place of longing, firmly situated in the past, and as a site of social activism where the representation of the countryside in contemporary times was essential. As the work of Blühova, Blitzka, Bauer, and Majernik illustrates, images of the countryside were continually entangled in the tensions between rural idealization and a claim to realism. These tensions were evoked through techniques that borrowed and adapted elements of new objectivity. In doing so, the depiction of rural Slovakia in their work effectively resisted simplistic visions of an urban-rural dichotomy and positioned the countryside as a contested ideological space whose multivalency could best be highlighted in the construction of new realisms across different media. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Do we have any questions?
Thank you. You said at the beginning that you will focus on Slovakia, of course, the subject is large, but can we draw parallels with the Austria or maybe some, how was the situation in Germany in terms of this that you were speaking about, rural, metropolitan, urban centers?
So if I may speak about photography specifically, it's a curious case because when I started my research, I was very interested in comparing how social photography in rural areas worked in Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. And with Austria, I could not find any examples. And I spoke to several experts of photography focusing on Austria specifically. And there is, of course, a lot of so-called Heimat photography, but nothing that would sort of take a leftist political direction. They mostly focused on Vienna. But the interesting thing is that even though groups such as the Friends of Nature, they, for example, they facilitated exhibitions like the Hungarian artists that were mentioned earlier, the Naturfreunde facilitated exhibitions of their work in Vienna. But when they went out to the countryside, because alpinism was a big way of how they would reach it, they would focus on like pretty alpine scenes. So there was this very, very strong emphasis on the rural idealization, which in the Austrian case also affected the work of leftist photographers who focused their critical view mostly on the city. And when it comes to Germany, there is one really amazing book that was published in the mid-1920s. I don't remember the name now, but it is so the photographer, he was a count who was disowned after 1918, and he worked in coal mines, and then he became a writer in Berlin. But in the mid-1920s, he traveled back to the countryside, and his focus is on how rural laborers in the countryside work. And he mostly photographed the home industries, toy production, the wood industry. And there you can sort of really see this very desolate countryside. It's also accompanied by reports of a lot of abuse of workers' rights, abuse of women. But I haven't found any other examples. If anyone knows, I would be very happy. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other question, perhaps?
Yeah, basically, it's interesting. Yeah, you mentioned the Heimat photography, which basically also in the culture milieu of Slovenia, after this brief period when photographers were experimenting with, let's say, new photography or new vision, Neusachlichkeit. Very soon, like 1934, there was a revival of this Heimat photography. But what they were using, they went back to pictorialism for some reason. About Slovak or Czechoslovak photography, what was I mean, was there like a similar kind of revival of this Heimat photography, and what kind of tools or approaches would they use?
Thank you for this question. I go back to this slide. Yeah. So I'm mentioning Blitzka and Koppitz because I think that they have quite a specific role in that. And the reason is that there is quite a nice anecdote of so Koppitz, he died in 1936. And just a few months before he died, there was a very, very big retrospective of his work. Now, he's interesting because he starts as a pictorialist. And then he goes into expressionist dance photography, and he adapts a lot of these very experimental modes then for his Heimat photographs that he shifts back to. And in this retrospective, there is a student, Jan Lukas, who later became quite a well-known Czech photographer and was a student of Koppitz, and he's interviewed for a newspaper about his view of the exhibition. And what Lukas says is that this is something, so he talks very strongly about this this specific vision and this idea of composition, that you need to very strictly define how you take the photograph. But he emphasizes that even though all people should take homeland photographs, Heimat photographs, this specific kind is reserved for experts like Blitzka and Koppitz, and he uses even the word of a stage director. So I think there was like there were two different interpretations. Even though when the popularity of Heimat photography rose, especially under Austrofascism, for example, but also in the 1930s, Czechoslovakia to some extent, that on the one hand there were the professionals who took these sort of pseudoscientific images, and then everyone else was encouraged to pick up the camera and take pictures, but they were told to really take this more pictorialist and also emotional approach. So it was like, show why you love the Heimat, this kind of impression. And they were the two different lines. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? No? Okay. Thank you a lot. Okay.